Hello, I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of 360 Thought Leadership Consulting and Webinar Program Manager for FP&A Trends. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us for our first global FP&A Trends webinar today. Integrated FP&A, Bridging the Strategy Gap. We are honored to have such a tremendously diverse global audience. We have registrations from over 36 countries on our webinar today. So welcome to everyone from across the globe. The statistics reveal that 60 to 90% of strategy implementations fail, with only 14% of executives are satisfied with the execution of strategies. Why do companies systematically fail to set meaningful and achievable targets that can help close the strategy gap? What should be the role of FP&A in strategic planning? Today, Michael Huthwaite, Strategic Finance Thought Leader and CEO at Financier, and Larissa Melnichuk, CEO at FP&A Trends Group, will explore the following questions and deliver insights that can impact the strategic value of FP&A at your company. What is integrated FP&A? What is the role of FP&A in strategic planning? What is the window of probability? How can we take advantage of it? How should we address uncertainty? And which techniques work through a compelling interactive conversation? Before I welcome our featured speakers of the webinar, I'm going to offer a few quick words about FP&A Trends, International FP&A Board, Global FP&A Trends webinar, and then cover a few housekeeping items. FP&A Trends Group is a fantastic resource for FP&A professionals across the globe delivering world-renowned thought leadership. Have the International FP&A Board, which is active in 15 cities, 11 countries, and 4 continents, and undergoing an expansion in the United States, currently with roundtables upcoming in San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago. We have FP&A Education, FP&A Trends Online Resource, tremendous articles and thought leadership, and we have global FP&A webinars and, of course, our roundtables. And then we also offer strategic consultancy and research. The mission of the International FP&A Board is to guide the development and promotion of best practices in global FP&A across the globe. We're hitting 36 countries today. Identify and support new trends, skill sets, and innovations. We developed our global FP&A webinar series to share FP&A better practices and thought leadership across the world. We will only deliver one webinar a month to make sure our audience has the best speakers and the most impactful content. A few housekeeping items. The slides are currently available under the handouts area in your GoToWebinar control panel. We will send you links via email to the presentation and recording over the next 24 to 48 hours. We'd like to hear from you, so please ask questions via the questions area in your GoToWebinar control panel at any time during the webinar. We'll do our best to get to your questions during the Q&A session. Finally, we appreciate your consideration in taking a short survey at the end of the webinar today, as we always strive to improve the ROI we offer our event attendees for their valuable time. Now it is first let me go ahead and go over our agenda today before I welcome our speakers. Our agenda today, we're going to start off with what is integrated FP&A. Next, what is the role of FP&A in strategic planning? An alternative way to view uncertainty. Part 2, a dynamic way to think about integrated FP&A. 3 essential steps for dealing with uncertainty. And then we're going to offer some concluding comments and our FP&A. Now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our featured speakers to the webinar, Mike Huthwaite and Larissa Melnichuk. Mike is the CEO of Financier. He's an experienced consultant and thought leader with over 17 years in the area of strategic finance. He started his career advising companies on valuation techniques using shareholder value added methodology. Later, he joined Hyperion Solutions and helped over 60 large multinational firms integrate strategic planning capabilities within their traditional budgeting and forecasting platform. Mike has worked alongside many top consulting firms on numerous projects around the world. He is a regular speaker and blog writer on topics of strategic finance, modeling with uncertainty and benefits of agile frameworks for finance. He's an executive MBA candidate at the Kellogg School of Management and a graduate of Boston College. Larissa Melnichuk is a founder and managing director of FP&A Trends. FP&A Trends helps companies realize their innovative FP&A potential through training, consulting, professional networking, and debating. She's an experienced FP&A practitioner, has held several senior FP&A positions at Infosys, Ace Group, KeyBank, and HPSC. Before setting up and running the International FP&A Board in 2003, a global and well-recognized FP&A best practices think tank. She has been driving the board expansion into 11 countries in Europe, the Middle East, USA, in Australia. With that, it is my pleasure to hand the floor over to Larissa. Larissa, the floor is yours. Please take it away. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much for this introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Very excited about our first global FP&A webinar this year, but actually it's the fourth one. So we started last year, and we had 3 very successful webinars. And the main idea of those webinars is to share the experience of International FP&A Board. As you know, we are already in 11 countries and 15 cities around the globe, and we generated so many interesting insights, and we are starting to share them with you. So integrated FP&A, why it's important. This is our today's business environment. It's incredible. So, and really it could be described very well with this quite well-known saying from Donald Rumsfeld, former US Defense Secretary. So there are known knowns, and this is our business as usual. We're quite good at this in FP&A, so we are really very good to forecast and plan our business as usual. But there are also known unknowns. This is our new initiative, this is our risk scenarios, something that we can control, but we need to adjust this to risk and other outputs. And we are quite good at this as well. But our today's environment is incredible from the point of view that there are so many unknowns. This is these black swans and perfect storms and situations that we never had before. So many companies need to change their business models. So many companies need to change their systems and so on and so far. So from this point of view, it's very important for us to have integrated financial planning and analysis. And what is integrated financial planning and analysis? There are different ways how we can look at this, but the most simplistic definition that we discussed at one of the London FP&A boards, this is the holistic view on generally three planning processes in organization. So generally speaking, we have strategic planning process, we have business planning, which is exactly FP&A, and we have operational planning. So holistic view, integration of our top-down and bottom-up processes. And then if we go to the next slide, in reality, it's also a horizontal integration. And again, it's too simplistic view because integration goes to different directions. But generally speaking, it's integration of different product lines and countries and different accounting statements, finance statements, P&L, balance sheet, and cash flow. So this is the view how we can look at integrated financial planning and analysis. And by the way, it's so much different from the view of vendors when they talk about integrated business planning. So the main benefits of integrated FP&A, obviously this is one consistent data model that is important. This is the visibility and ability to drill down and slice and dice information almost in real time. This is faster planning and forecasting cycles. And the level of granularity, so some of the companies, some of the leading organizations I know, they really can go almost to the customer level with these key drivers, external and internal. So this is how deeply it goes at the moment with the way of the technology and introduction of new analytical methods. And obviously the most important one, it allows us to have quicker decision-making process in this incredible environment of unknowns. So if we go to the next one, what is the role of FP&A in strategic planning? This is a very interesting question, and we're about to have a survey to finalize to see what is happening in the organizations. But what I see around the globe, that traditional companies, they still, FP&A still has a very passive role in strategic planning and long-range planning and so on and so far. But the things are changing, and as strategic planning becoming more analytical and more connected to operational and business planning, we really see how FP&A takes responsibility for models and systems and driving the strategic planning process as well. How FP&A can do this? Obviously, this is through this analytical process and through key drivers that are cascaded through different levels of planning processes. And they're implemented through driver-based model and through one planning system. So this is the way how we see integration in FP&A, and this is how we see the role of FP&A in strategic planning, business planning, and operational planning process. At this particular webinar, we are going to investigate the difference, the connection between strategic planning and business planning. So how they connected and how we can help the strategic planning process to be more integrated, more analytical, and how FP&A can take part in this. So the next one, I believe, is the survey question, the first polling question, and Ernie will help to run this.
All right. Thank you very much, Larissa. Thank you very much for your fantastic insights. In order to help set the stage for the rest of our content, gone ahead and launched our first polling question, asking you to share with us how you would characterize FP&A's current role in your strategic planning process at your company. We would appreciate everyone's consideration in answering our polling question here today. A couple logistical notes. We can still take your questions in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. And I want to make sure we take advantage of the opportunity to tap into a couple of world-renowned experts in this area. So please feel free to ask your questions at any time again. And I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for just a few more seconds. Then we're going to go ahead and close that. And we're going to share the results and get maybe some thoughts from Larissa. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to bring in Mike to the webinar. And Mike and Larissa are going to have an interactive conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and go ahead and share those results. And first I will ask you, Larissa, do you have any initial thoughts here or take on the polling question results for us?
Actually, no surprises here. We see that definitely it becoming more and more active. So it's we are pleased to see that 22% of the respondents said that they are very active, and FP&A is a key player in the process. Somewhat active, 32%. So altogether, you know, we see that it's quite an active role, and only 5% say that it's non-existent. Mike, what is your experience with this?
Yeah, hi Larissa, and thanks for inviting me on. Yeah, I think the same thing. I think FP&A is starting to focus a little bit more on strategic planning and the benefits of strategic planning, and so I like to see that the numbers are at least in favor of you know, taking it on, and then hopefully we can find a reason why the lower 5% is not, but hopefully the rest of the presentation will change that way of thinking.
Great, fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. And now I would like to give microphone to Michael Huthwaite, so to share the experience about what an alternative way to think about the strategy gap. And before Mike starts to share his insights with us, I would like just to share with you that we've been having these interesting discussions and conversations with Michael for some time now. I know Michael more than 5 years, and actually he helped in strategic planning process in one of my companies, FTSE 100 company with headquarters here in the UK. We had a number of discussions, and Mike presented at one of the London FP&A boards about strategic planning and contributed with many interesting and very popular articles on the subject. And I would like to say that he's a real thought leader with original ideas and a lot of passion about this subject. And we are very grateful and very excited to have you, Mike, today to present your ideas about the subject.
Thank you very much, Larissa.
You're welcome.
It's been a pleasure over the years to continuously have this conversation about the strategy gap and strategic planning. And I guess the best way to start off really understanding the strategy gap is to really take a step back and start with something before that. And that key word really is the word uncertainty. So a lot of being able to understand the strategy gap and crossing it deals primarily with your understanding for the word uncertainty. Now, clearly, I don't own the word uncertainty. You're free to have your own definitions for the term. But let me start by giving you a less useful approach to dealing with the word uncertainty. So that is when the prefix "un" in uncertainty means not. And when that's the case, really you see things in black and white. So we have complete certainty or we have complete uncertainty. In fact, most of the time when you look at a concept afresh or new, the chances are for most people to say it either is or it isn't is kind of the standard response. I've seen a lot of publications, a lot of writing that people do refer to uncertainty as really the opposite of certainty. And I just don't think that that really adds anything to this discussion. Obviously, we know what we know, but is everything else really uncertain? I think we can go a layer deeper into that and really figure that out. So let me go ahead and flip the slide here and propose really a second proposal for how to look at uncertainty. So a more useful approach to dealing with uncertainty. And that's when you look at the prefix "un" to mean lack of. So when you have a lack of certainty, then what you really do is you kind of set up two polar extremes here on a timeline or on a line where we have certainty on one end, complete true certainty. We know it, it's a fact, it's historical at this point. And we go all the way out to the other end and we have complete uncertainty where, you know, anything could possibly happen. The beauty of this approach is that in between we have what everyone would call probability, right? So varying degrees of probability. Obviously, as you get out to the uncertainty area, much less probability. As we get closer to the certainty area, much greater probability. But the beauty of it all is that we should be in a better position to measure probability. And that's really the key, one of the key elements here. As we bring this into FP&A, you know, we know the mantra in FP&A that if you can measure it, you can manage it. And I think FP&A does a decent job of managing probability. Certainly when we do our initial forecasts and projections, we base them on kind of what we expect things to happen. So we have some understanding for probability. But as we move on to that uncertainty, we really don't have the best management skills when it comes to uncertainty. So I'm going to suggest a few later on in the session that are going to help us out. But let me go ahead and just take this a step further here and talk about that kind of classical people, process, technology concept. So when we're dealing in a world full of certainty or higher degrees of probability, then what are we really doing with our people? Well, we're really trying to maximize predictability by collecting data from those individuals who have the best insight, right? So it's the individuals who have the probability understanding, the predictability. Either they have that insight or they're responsible for managing that. And so therefore they have a greater insight into the predictability. And we collect that information from those people. Now the key here, and this is one of the key things of the whole webinar, is that when your predictability is low, you have to switch to a completely different tactic. And that tactic is a tactic of influencing. When you don't have probability on your side or probability is very weak, you really need to switch to be more of an influencer. So you want to try to influence the future outcomes. You want to try to build consensus among your small peer team. That's how you get things done. And you want to allow for much more discussion and debate, okay? And you want to be obvious that what you're doing is influencing. You know, you're not in a realm of probability, you're in a realm of influencing, and that's how you navigate uncertainty. So that's a key. If I look at the processes that we typically use, again, when we have higher degree of certainty, we tend to try to capture that data across business silos. But in order to do that, we have to create highly orchestrated communication processes to allow those individuals to know when we want to collect that high predictability numbers, high probability numbers. And so we go through a lot of processes in FP&A to collect that information, which I think everyone will argue takes a lot of time, but that's part of the process of trying to collect data that we feel is valuable, so we go through the effort of collecting it. I know there'll be a lot of discussion and debate on that, but that's the concept there. As we move over to a world of uncertainty, you know, where we don't have the probability, the best approach is to be more continuously screening and evaluating for alternative outcomes and get other people's perspectives and buy-ins on different ideas. So it's more of a constant screening for activity because we have very little probability. We need to keep our radar out looking for things to come about. And I'll talk about this more a little later. Lastly, if we talk about the technology side of things, typically, why we leverage EPM, CPM suites is because they're really good at lowering the cost of acquiring that information that is all based on probability and predictability. And so that's why we use those tools. When we move into uncertainty, really, I would argue that the best tools in place would be tools that are self-service modeling solutions that promote iterative and agile analysis. So I'm thinking more in line like spreadsheets, but even spreadsheets suffer a lot of limitations in this uncertainty world. So we need to do a better job from the vendor side to produce more solutions that really truly address uncertainty and not address it in the same way that we handle more certainty, more traditional certainty situations. So I think that gets us to our second polling questions. I'll pass it on over to Ernie at this point, I guess.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your great content. Just want to go ahead and launch our next polling question. Just asking you to share with us the degree of you believe that a strategy gap exists at your company. And just a reminder, we appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of our polling questions here today. Mike, can you come in here and give us a little bit more color on the on what you mean by strategy gap, so we can get the most accurate responses here?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, in fact, actually, the next slide that I'm going to show is going to tee up the strategy gap quite well. But the strategy gap, is that boundary for which we go from thinking we know probability to where we don't really have that probability. It's kind of the fog of things where we could probably stick some escalation rate at the end of our numbers and just call it a plan, but we really know that we don't have a good basis for probability to make that call, and that's the point at which we need to switch over. So yeah, we will talk about that a little bit more, but it'd be interesting to see kind of, I guess, at this point, what the intro thoughts are.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling question. Go ahead and share the results. And looks like we've got a big percent, significant, 37%, and 42% somewhat significant, and 14% extremely significant. So we've got over 40% significant or extremely significant. Mike, what are your initial thoughts there? What you expected, higher, lower?
Yeah, Ernie, I'm not looking at the actual responses, but it sounds like you're saying it's a significant problem. Is that what I'm hearing?
Right. Yeah, let me go ahead. Yeah, we have 37% is significant, and extremely significant is 14%. So we've got, 41%, and then we've got 42% at somewhat significant. So there's only 8% where we're seeing like as not an issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think crossing the strategy gap and eliminating the strategy gap is literally one of the most important things we as FP&A professionals can focus on. I mean, we have to be able to be a balanced planning process. We have to be able to balance tactical planning with strategic planning, make the most out of our strategic planning in a way that wants our managers to have confidence and be inspired and incentivized to actually want to make those strategy plans a reality by bringing them into the tactical world. So I'm not surprised to see such high numbers. And I think that's an area that as FP&A in general, as well as the larger community, we need to spend more time focusing on solutions and answers for this, because we've gotten really far in tactical planning recently, and I think we've kind of butted up to the strategy gap, and we need to burst through that.
Great, thank you very much, Mike, and we'll let you go back and get back to your content on addressing uncertainty.
Okay, great. So I'm flipping on to kind of our section 2 here. So what I want to do is maybe even bring Larissa back into this conversation here if I can. We've all seen kind of a classic planning construct, right? This isn't anything new. We've all seen this before. We have kind of a dotted line going across that kind of is our expected growth where we plan to be. But obviously as time goes on, we can deviate from that, right? Larissa, does that very familiar with you? Yeah, it gets used all the time. But let's go ahead and bring in what we know we just talked about a second ago, where we have certainty, kind of the window of probability, and then uncertainty. So certainty is obviously everything that's historical in this case. Then we have sort of the window of probability. Now, the window of probability here, I've said, is about 3 to 18 months. But the reality is the window of probability is different by every industry, by every company, by every department, and even by season. Okay, so it's not a consistent window, and it's not even consistent across the same company. So while you might be able to have pretty good visibility over your costs, you might have very poor visibility and probability over your revenues, for example. So the idea to say that the strategy gap and planning lines up specifically with certain time planning processes that we do, like a 1-year budget, 18-month rolling forecast, and so on, it's really difficult to do that when you're actually crossing, and I'll just draw the line here, you're crossing the strategy gap during some of those planning processes. You're going from a state where you have decent probability to a state where it's better to do an alternative approach because it's more effective than weak probability, and we'll get into that in a bit. But that's really the strategy gap there. And if I can go ahead and just frame up the boxes here, we're starting to identify a little quadrant being developed in the middle of this diagram. So to the left of the strategy gap, what we really should be focusing on is tactics, right? That's the definition of tactics. Tactics is when you have a target and you're trying to execute on that target. Now, things will come up all the time, but those things that come up are really hurdles, right? You're trying to jump hurdles. Because you're in the short time frame, you can't move out constraints. The constraints are going to stay the way they are. The hurdles are going to come in, and you just need to be able to jump those hurdles. As we move past the strategy gap and we're into true uncertainty, we can approach uncertainty in a way where we make early initial investments up front in order to push out the boundaries and the constraints that we had in the short time frame. We can move those out to our advantage. We can enter those opportunities, and ideally we can create a barrier for our competition to come in. And that's really true strategy, right? And it all starts by making early investments and moving into those spaces. And obviously, if you're above your expectation line there, you're creating value. And if you're below that, you're losing value. Now,
Mike, I would like to make the parallel with, it's an interesting picture that actually could be compared to the current value agent rolling forecast process. So obviously we are talking about good quality rolling forecast that is based on drivers that is implemented through the system. One of the most important things in rolling forecast, this is to remember that it's really good to forecast business as usual. And it's very important for rolling forecast to distinguish between business as usual and any strategic or initiative projects. So what I see happening now with good rolling forecast processes, companies have different ways of window of probability. So it's not obviously exactly 18 months as many people think. For some companies, the window of probability or the window of predictability is only 6 months. For some of them, it's really 24 months. But also some of the companies, they have different products in line that have different windows of probability. So what it means that companies are starting to be really very creative with their rolling forecast process. And then they use this really very well for predicting business as usual. But obviously predicting the window of probabilities and uncertainty, this is much more difficult process. So the question is how we can use driver-based model and rolling forecast to predict uncertainty.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a big fan of the driver-based approach of having a model that's dynamically redrawn when you change variables and it reforecasts. So that's sort of a rolling forecast construct. We use that same sort of construct in the strategic world as well. Where I see rolling forecast typically, I guess, being optimized, I would say, is in what you said there about the window of probability kind of growing and shrinking and being different for different parts of the organization and so forth. I think a rolling forecast is an extremely efficient way to make sure that you're on top of your window of probability at all times. One of the things we'll talk about a little later is that there's a risk element if we run into uncertainty and we try to use driver-based relationships where they're managed by individual users. So you have individual users entering in line item forecasts using their rolling forecast tool. Tends to happen when you have uncertainty is those things just kind of escalate out. So you get the hockey stick growth because you really don't know what that future is, right? It's just truly unknown. Your probability is just a real guess. And so we end up with like hockey stick growth in the out years, even with some rolling forecast planning, which then ultimately what happens is people don't believe in the strategic plan. They don't have much, faith in it, and it gets kind of sidelined as a second-class citizen. And I think we want to avoid that. So there's just some little differences on the back end there, but I definitely think that having a rolling forecast and a strategic planning environment that obviously integrate together very well are going to help. And let me actually just show what I would call these quadrants here to give you kind of a little bit more view for this. So when we're talking about being very tactical and trying to beat the expectation and create value for the organization, we're really looking at being efficient, right? We're just trying to be more efficient than where we were today. Rolling forecasting can definitely help us be more efficient, but it can also, there are also other technologies out there. I mean, one of the big ones coming down the pipe is going to be AI, artificial intelligence, using big data. Big data is all transactional data. It's information about now. We can take that information about now and we can apply it now, and we can be very efficient now, which is great. As we move out again, we look at more of the opportunity side of things. You know, the only way to move those boundaries is to make early investments to move those boundaries out. So we have to be actively planning for new opportunities, breaking down barriers, creating barriers for people to follow you. But we need to be visualizing those now because we need to make those investments now. Down in the risk corner, you know, obviously we're in the window of probability, so we can manage that risk. We can understand the risk elements that are in play, and we can try to use risk management to eliminate those risks. As we move further out and we're in the uncertainty world, what really creates value loss for organizations are the things like the black swans, right? The things that take a company out of business. They didn't see it coming in 5 years, 5 years down the road, and it's taken them out of business. But we're also looking at things like competitive advantage, competition, quite frankly, and I'll address those in the next slide as well. So this is a great way to start with the classic planning construct and then just add strategy gap into the middle and really get kind of that visual of what we're trying to do here. Now I'm going to show the same slide here, just with a slight difference, a little fancier looking, but it's the same slide. I think the future of integrated planning is actually going to shift away from formal planning processes with arbitrary time constraints. So we're talking about 1-year budget, 18-month forecast, 5-year plans, because really any one of those can straddle the strategy gap, right? The strategy gap is a moving thing depending on industry, company, department, so forth, seasonality, and so forth. We need to get away from that. We need to recognize and tell our people and have the conversation for where we think the window of probability is at any given point for any individual involved in the planning process. So we know what we're dealing with here. So at the bottom of this graph, rather than put any sort of time logic at the bottom, we just talk in terms of certainty. Do we have high certainty? Do we have low certainty? Otherwise, the graph is exactly the same. And again, I talked a little bit about some of the things that are at play here. I think most FP&A really focuses on efficiency, which is great. And I think, again, the future, big data, artificial intelligence, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think risk, obviously, again, risk management, tools like Monte Carlo simulation will be great for mitigating the risk and destroying shareholder value. As we move up into the upper right, that's the opportunity quadrant. That's where I spend my consulting activities. I think there we're talking about things like real options, advanced scenario analysis. We want to create disruption, right? We want to be that disruptor. We want to break business norms by making investments that change the game we can follow and no one else can come in. And we want to be able to influence the market. That's what you have to do when you don't have probability. And finally, again, it's that threat. So competitive analysis, game theory, screening for black swans, those sort of things. So I think that gets us back to our third and final polling question. So Ernie, I'll pass it back to you for that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mike, for your fantastic comment. Mike said we just have gone ahead and launched our third polling question, asking you to share with us the main tool that you use in your strategic planning process. Spreadsheets, EPM, CPM tools, whether your focus might be more on the presentation, BI side, and of course we all use communication tools, email, internally. So I'm going to, in order to be mindful of our time, I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up just for a few more seconds. Then I'm going to take a quick pass and share the results. Then we're going to get back to Mike's fabulous content, and he's going to talk about his essential tips for dealing with uncertainty. So let me go ahead and close the polling question here and just share those results. Looks like we've got, unsurprisingly, 63% spreadsheets, 63% spreadsheet, 16% EPM, CPM tools, and then 19% focused on the presentation tools. So a little bit surprised to see so many, and they're still in the spreadsheet area, but I think we're seeing some traction in the EPM, CPM tool space. So thank you very much, everyone, for your consideration answering the polling question. So Mike, let's go ahead, in order to be mindful of our time, and get back to your content on dealing with uncertainty.
Sure, great. Thanks, Ernie. And so really this last bit is about what we can do to improve, right? So the essential tips for dealing with uncertainty. So we don't really know what the future is going to hold in uncertainty, right? I mean, that's the fair $1 million obvious statement, I guess, the elephant in the room. But what we do know is that every investment proposal, every strategic plan that we look at, every scenario, if we think about it, it really always follows a J curve, right? So the J curve is the answer to modeling in uncertainty. Now you'll notice at the bottom, we're not using time periods, we're using stages, right? So you have your investment stage. So that's when you're going to make your initial investments to be able to change the boundaries that exist in the future so that you can exploit those and benefit from them and hopefully not let other people come in and do the same thing. And eventually you move up into, acceleration and plateau stages and decline stage, and then ultimately steady state. And so those are really the stages that we all see in a J curve. I think everyone's seen a J curve. You might call it something else, you might call it a hype cycle or a product life cycle, but they're all really the same concept, right? They're all a J curve. Couple line items I want to point out here, and I've mentioned a few of these already. By following a J curve into uncertainty, you really avoid, and this is critical, you avoid entering into uncertainty by just using individual line item forecasts, right? If you let everyone else go ahead and put together an individual line item forecast for the future in uncertainty, you're going to get a lot of hockey stick growth, a lot of meaningless growth that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a bunch of individual expectations that don't kind of hang together. And again, what ends up happening, my experience as a consultant, is people just ignore them, right? That is one of the biggest reasons for the strategy gap. It's not that you have, technical limitations, can't link things up. It's that people really don't believe in them, or they weren't able to create, strategies that transcend down enough, that make sense, that are achievable, that incentivize management to want to achieve those things. But in addition to that, if you want to be able to do a J curve, you have to look at the future and uncertainty by either strategic projects or by a strategy level or even by a strategic business unit level. So you got to figure out, again, I've used the word before, that we want to be more of like a real option. Well, real options, if you look up that word, it always is based on an asset, right? What is the asset? What are the opportunities we can do with our assets? And in this case, a project, a strategy, a strategic business unit, they're all assets in that category. So you figure out what they are, what are your opportunities, and you look at the potential outcomes for those. In order to do a J curve, you need to be able to ignore sunk costs. So you have to stop looking at sunk costs. And in that case, most ratios as well. So a lot of like the return on investment type ratios, a lot of those are going to be misleading because you're focused on sunk costs. You have to remember that cash is king. Cash is king is a very big part of J curves and dealing with uncertainty. And you have to realize that ultimately you will run into a steady state. A lot of people don't like to think that, but it's due to a lot of things. I mean, a couple of them are just competition creeping in, technology innovations changing. Eventually, your shiny idea is going to ultimately hit a steady state, and that's obviously when you need to innovate and come up with a new strategy. In short, really, the J curve really is the yellow brick road for dealing with uncertainty. So I'm going to move along here to the. Yep, go ahead, Larissa. I'm sorry.
Just a quick comment on J curve. Really, a very good indication how strategic and influential FP&A should become in order to manage this J curve, in order to stay at the top of the game. And especially it's important in current world when we have so many different products. Let's look at banking portfolio. Let's look at mortgage portfolio where hundreds of thousands customers, a different level of development and life cycle, and different profitability of the products. So definitely I see that FP&A has become really creative in managing these J curves and also managing the portfolios of different products in the business. So thank you for sharing this.
Yep, no, thank you. Okay, so we have two more here. I'm keeping my eye on the clock here, so I want to try to get through these in the next 5 minutes or so. Another essential tip for dealing with uncertainty is realizing that we need to do a constant screening process. So when we plan under uncertainty, it shouldn't be a formal annual, quarterly process. Rather, it needs to be an ongoing process that provides valuable insight, right? So we can find current opportunities and avoid threats. So how does that typically look like? Well, again, because you don't have probability on your side here, you're dealing in uncertainty, you need to come up with what you believe the opportunities are and what you believe the threats are. I mean, literally just jot them down on a paper, and you'll look at those, and then you'll decide a percentage of those might be worth modeling. Okay, so you look at modeling those, modeling a bunch of different real options, looking at different risk profiles for those things that you're modeling and so forth. And inevitably, a lot of those are, they die on the vine, we like to say. So we throw them away, we come up with a new idea, it's just been discarded, right? It's like on Shark Tank or the Dragon's Den, you just got cast away. A percentage of those that you model actually get considered a little further, right? And so they go into sort of a monitoring stage, and you're monitoring them a little further, monitoring them a little further, and then ultimately a very small percentage of all the things that you've been screening for, you actually take action on. And I pull this out because obviously you can tell what you're doing when you're screening. If you're doing it effectively, you're looking at a funnel process. And again, this is a funnel process that really doesn't follow rolling forecast per se. It's really a unique way to handle uncertainty. It's the best way to handle uncertainty. And in fact, the best way for you to do this is to be able to get to the next level of the funnel, right, to take action, is you have to become a really good influencer. So it's your job as an FP&A professional to be able to pull ideas down into the smaller buckets, right? So again, we're looking at things like real options, what could happen. Let's identify those, let's model those. The mantra in uncertainty has to be model multiple views of the future. Multiple views of the future, multiple different risk profiles of the future, really understand what is, think of it as the chessboard and you need to make your moves. What are your options? And not a single version of the truth, right? We're not about trying to capture a single version of the truth. That's very important, but that's not the critical point for modeling an uncertainty. And again, being the influencer is the key to pull down the funnel. So the last essential tip that I want to talk about here is that we need to do a much better job of embracing an agile framework. So we've all kind of heard about agile a little bit. Agile really, involves having sprints, but every investment proposal, every strategy that you're looking at, every key decision that you're trying to make for your organization really should, especially when you're dealing with uncertainty, should be treated as a sprint. Okay, in sprints, you usually start out with maybe one or two people. They spearhead the initial bit of the model build. Maybe they build an initial template, or they take an initial template and they augment it up. and then they start to share it out, okay? And when they share it out, they typically share it out into a second sprint. And then they walk through a sprint with 3 or 4 people, and then maybe do another sprint and another sprint and another sprint. It's usually, you know, a small team exercise, 5 to 10 people in sprints, and the object is to get better and better each time. So again, every evaluation should be a sprint. It's totally fine to start with prototypes, right? You don't need to know everything in the model up front. Sometimes we spend too much time trying to make the model perfect at the beginning. I can tell you as a consultant, we call that calibration. What calibration do I need the model to be to work right? I can tell you we've never gotten it right first time, because inevitably it always changes when you're looking at different projects, and there's always things you want to add. So when you sprint through those as a prototype, as a beta even, you'll be able to understand what is the metadata that we need for that model, what is the right chart of accounts and drivers and so forth for that. In addition to that, we need to, as part of the agile process, we need to be able to solicit feedback and suggestions, right? So this comes to a lot of things. Right now, EPM technology is really great at creating swim lanes, right? So it uses predefined access controls and predefined workflows to put people into certain lanes where they're able to enter their information, and then they submit that up for approval and so forth. That creates swim lanes, and that's not a good approach for dealing with uncertainty. We want to be able to break down swim lanes and allow more sprints, agile sprints, where individuals are providing feedback and suggestions that can be accepted or rejected, but that's the best way to handle uncertainty, not just have one person put together a plan for the future and try to get everyone else to say yes or no when it really doesn't have any buy-in. Okay, and then lastly, again, I've said this a few times, the goal really in an agile world or in uncertainty is to become more of a disruptive hacker, change the future, figure out how we can break what is currently working today to make it an advantage for us in the future, and make it so we can stretch out our J curves as long as we can and increase shareholder value for our company. So those are the essential tips. I'm just leaving here with kind of our final conclusion. I don't really want to read this off the screen here, but the strategy gap exists primarily because, you know, we as leaders haven't really incentivized and inspired our management teams to actually achieve these goals. We've just done some poor planning that doesn't really stick together. We've done a lot of hockey stick planning. We haven't really sold the whole strategy through the J curve. When we get to tactical planning has seen a lot of improvement over the years. It continues to improve, and it will improve a lot more in the future. AI, predictive analytics, perfect example. But in order for us to really address the strategy gap, and if the strategy gap is really important to us and we want to grow value and drive it the right way, we need to take a step back. We need to understand what uncertainty really means, and we need to be able to address it in ways that really solve the problem. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. I guess, Ernie, I'm going to throw it back to you for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike, for your great comments and insights. So I'm going to go ahead and formally open the Q&A process so I can still take your questions in the questions area of your go-to webinar control panel. Mike, let me go ahead and ask you the first question. We have several questions around specific tactics. You talked a lot about influencing kind of across the enterprise. Can you give us maybe some strategies that you've seen work in organizations in order to influence folks outside of finance for us?
Sorry, Ernie, I had the mute button on.
All right.
I think, you know, originally I think what I heard though is the classic starting point. So we often think about influencing and who does the best influencing, and the reality is, right, the people at the top tend to be ones who gather a lot of influence just by their position, their seniority, their title, their relevance in modeling and so forth. But that doesn't need to be the case, right? I think strategy can be run anywhere. I think the people that have the subject matter expertise, whether they be, you know, line of business without finance experience, that could be a great place to start. But what I would suggest happen is the same thing. We need to get agile even in that environment. So in order for someone in a line of business to get their idea to move up the chain, you need to actually convince, discuss, and debate your peers. So it starts with your peers. That builds a bigger boulder, and that bigger boulder kind of rolls down the hill and collects more moss. Is the bad example I'm trying to give you, but that's the best way. You need to use a little bit of politicking skills, build consensus within your small team, and then maybe try to take that and build consensus on another larger team up the chain, to be able to ultimately get it to the level where it's being monitored, it's being screened, and we take action.
Great. Thank you very much. I think one of the important points that I want to point out from your comment, Mike, which was great, was that it doesn't have to be top down. I think it has to be a bottom up approach and share that value, and then have that value kind of go up the chain. So you have multiple C-suite folks getting on board with things. Larissa, can you share with us how companies have been successful in really engaging with the C-suite, and maybe share a few of the challenges that folks are facing and how some companies have been able to overcome those?
Thank you for the question. Yes, it's a very good question, and the biggest challenge in introduction of analytical approach to strategic planning and to strategic FP&A, obviously this is the traditional budgeting culture. So the biggest challenge we have that the culture, the budget, the set of fixed targets for the year, they still so much embedded in the company's cultures. And actually they're also promoted by many of board of directors in the company, especially at the traditional companies. How to address it? This is the biggest question that we discuss during our FP&A boards, and people share their experience, how they started to address it. So if traditionally CEO at the beginning of 5-year strategic plan process sends these targets to different business units in different countries, like I expect growth of 15%, I expect introduction of new products, and so on and so forth. FP&A comes with this analytical model that shows what is realistic, what is not. And what is very important that FP&A's view is independent. It's not connected to the target. It's not connected to particular markets. So through analytical experience, through implementation of driver-based models, and also going beyond our traditional accounting periods, we really can influence the culture of the company. But another thing what already started to do, and we see this at different FP&A boards around the globe, all together we develop the content and maturity models where the leading companies should be. And when you have this independent view and when you screen your company against the leading organizations, obviously it makes a difference, and also it influences the company's leaders to change the culture as well. So this is very shortly to answer the question. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Larissa. And Larissa mentioned the FP&A analytics maturity model. And I think a good place for resources on any of these topics more in depth is the FP&A Trends website. You can just go in and put a search, and you can pull up some great articles and insights. But the FP&A maturity model is an excellent way. You can really look at things by people, process, and technology, where you're at and where you want to go and what it takes to get you there. And you really have to get to that right end, into that transformative state to really, I think, close that strategy gap. Mike, next question. I will go your way. So just as a couple folks are this is kind of a different way of thinking for them a little bit. So to get started on trying to just look at what this strategy gap looks like, how would you suggest someone starts, if they're just starting off and looking at this? I think it exists. Yeah. How do I get my arms around it? And then what should I do?
Yeah, I think the best place to start is actually just communication. So I would go back through your organization as an FP&A leader and try to understand from the people submitting data where their window of probability exists. I mean, if you don't want to use those terms, just understand, do you have how high is your probability in the next 3 months? How high is your probability in the next 6 months? And so forth. And really get a feel for how that window of probability is either the same or different across different departments within the organization. Because ultimately that's going to tell you where your strategy gap is, if you can get a truthful answer out of them. And you'll find, in our diagram, that strategy gap was just a vertical line. But it will be a zigzag line, usually based on, different departments and so forth. So that helps a lot because that tells you where the strategy gap is. And then, after that, you're sort of looking at, what is better? Is it better for me to collect detailed information that is less accurate? Or do we need to start switching over to more of an influential mode once we hit that uncertainty? And maybe even try it out just in a little small area and see if you don't see more success. But we spend a lot of time capturing information in basically what is uncertainty, but we don't treat it like that right now. And it's just worthless data that we don't really believe in, we don't have a lot of faith in. It'd be much better to say, look, we've got really good reliability on this data, and the rest is getting a bit hazy. So let's try an influential approach rather than essentially mining for good statistical data.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. I think that's a fantastic way to close our Q&A session. Again, those of you who didn't get to your questions, we'll follow up with you directly after the webinar. I'd like to go ahead and turn the floor over to Larissa. Can you give us a little preview of what's coming up next in terms of our webinars, and then also mention on the roundtable front, Larissa?
Thank you, Ernie. So we are committed to deliver interesting and original content to you, to share these case studies with you and FP&A thought leadership. So all these case studies that you see on the screen in the next couple of months, this is the case studies that we discussed at different FP&A boards in Germany, in Switzerland, in many other countries. So we will keep you informed, and please see what is coming your way. There will be more interesting vendor agnostic case studies and FP&A thought leadership as well.
Great.
Thank you, Ernie.
Thank you very much, Larissa. And I'd like to once again thank Mike and Larissa for your tremendous insights. Thank you very much. Just a reminder, our attendees, you'll have the opportunity to request to be connected with either or both of our great speakers in the post-webinar survey, which will launch immediately after my closing comments. And finally, to you, our audience, thank you so much for your valuable time today. We hope to see you in person in an upcoming International FP&A Board Roundtable and on our next Global FP&A webinar. Make the rest of your day great, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. Thank you, everyone.